How on earth do you go from being Australia's #1 tennis champion to being a champion in the world of irrelevance? Now, you probably already know who we're talking about by now, but just in case you don't, we're talking about this guy. The Australian kid that went from smashing records at just 14 years old to wrecking his own career right before our very eyes. Meet Bernard Tomic, the failed Australian tennis star. Now, if you know a thing or two about tennis, then you'd agree that passion is like that secret sauce that brings out the best in many of the game's GOATs. And in Bernard's case, it was no different. This kid was head over heels in love with tennis from a ridiculously young age. For him, there was just something about how graceful the game was. So while his mates were busy drooling over candy, little Bernard strolled into a store and snagged his very first tennis racket at the tender age of 8. By the time he hit 12, Bernard was demolishing his opponents in international 18 and under junior events without even breaking a sweat. Throughout his junior career, the Australian won an Orange Bowl title and 2 junior Grand Slam singles titles, the 2008 Australian Open and the 2009 US Open. Who the heck does that at 12 years old? Bernard Tomic, that's who. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because by the time he turned 14, young Bernard made history when he became the youngest player ever to be granted access into the Australian Open. Bernard Tomic's entrance into the Australian Open at such a young age created quite the buzz in the tennis world. It was like the tennis world got struck by lightning and fireworks all at once. When Bernard turned 15, he decided to go pro and started competing in ATP tournaments. And to anyone that watched him play, it was clear that the young Australian was tennis's next big thing. And he proved it, because at the age of 24, Tomic achieved a career-high singles ranking of world number 17. So, where did it all go so horribly wrong? Now, here's the thing. You see, to a lot of folks out there, Tomic's case is yet another file in the category of young, inexperienced players that let fame and all that dough that comes with it get to their head. And if we're being honest, it's not far from the truth. But when you take a closer look at the whole saga, you'll realize that poor Bernard was just an unfortunate victim of failed parenting. You see, as soon as young Bernard showed interest in tennis, his parents, John and Adisa Tomic, did what any loving parents would do. They supported their son's dreams. But for John, it was more than just supporting his son's dreams. It was his dream too. And as much as this sounds like a loving father having his son's back, it's anything but that. It was his chance to live out his own tennis fantasies through his son. He became so obsessed with the idea of being the father of a successful tennis player that he made himself Bernard's coach as soon as the kid kicked off his tennis career. But the problem was, John knew nothing about tennis. So, like you would expect, he turned out to be a horrible coach. He was so horrible that he became the architect of his son's downfall. It all began with John's brilliant strategy of making Bernard ditch matches right in the middle of the game. You see, during a minor league futures match back in 2008, John ordered Bernard to straight up walk off the court and quit during his match against Marinko Mitosevic, as he believed his son was being cheated by officials. And for some reason, he convinced himself that quitting the match was the only solution. Now, Bernard was just a spry 16-year-old at the time, so he didn't really have a choice but to obey his dad like a puppet on strings. What John didn't realize was that when it came to tennis rules, the folks in charge are strict to the teeth. So in the end, Bernard faces the consequences. The Australian was slammed with a $1,500 fine and 1-month ban from the competition. But that was the least of the insane things that John made his son do. You see, later that same year, John would go on to turn the entire professional Australian tennis community against Bernard after he rejected a practice invitation from Leighton Hewitt. To give you some perspective, Leighton is a Grand Slam champion and former world #1. So for any other rookie, getting that invite would have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to learn from one of the best players in the world. But John didn't just reject the invitation. He rejected it with a message that said that Leighton wasn't a good enough match for his son. When you think about it, that's one of the funniest jokes of the century, because Leighton made it to the quarterfinals of Wimbledon that year, and Tomic didn't even make it past the qualifying round. Ouch. And as if that wasn't enough, John was arrested and sentenced to 8 months behind bars after he assaulted Thomas Drouet, one of his son's practice partners. It was so bad that Drouet ended up with a broken nose and had to wear a neck brace for a couple of weeks. Damn! It must suck to have a dad that turns your practice mate into a punching bag. So, while a lot of kids his age would look up to their dads, Bernard hated his dad. Because he didn't just drain the life out of him, he also started to drain the love that he had for the sport. Now, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you have to constantly live in the shadows of an obsessive parent, you'd understand how hard it was for Bernard. But the most unfortunate part was that John started to rub off on his son, so much that Bernard slowly lost himself in the image of his father. With the horrible training that he got from his dad, Bernard started tanking mid-match as the norm. He would habitually give up if he was losing, or in his words, when he just got bored. You see, back in 2012, former tennis GOAT John McEnroe called the Australian out after he lost a match in the Miami Masters on purpose. But John wasn't the only tennis guru that noticed the Australian's nonchalant attitude to the game, because just a year later, Bernard was caught tanking again in a match against Andy Murray the following year. As the years rolled on, it became painfully obvious that Bernard's tanking habits were spiraling out of control. It was like he had a PhD in the art of not giving a single tennis ball. But in 2014, Bernard decided to take it to a whole new level. He broke a world record. But before you get excited and all, it wasn't the kind of record you'd be proud of. It was the shortest match ever played in the entire history of tennis. I'm talking about a grand total of 28 minutes. And to top it off, he lost every single game, 6-0, against Jarkko Nieminen. Now, that's a record you wouldn't want to flaunt at a tennis club. Or anywhere for that matter. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, Bernard tried to play the blame game. He claimed that his abysmal performance was all because of his recent hip surgery. Even if there's a tiny bit of truth to that, that excuse doesn't hold water when it comes to tanking matches left and right. In fact, his little pity party game ended up costing him big time, because the season wrapped up with Bernard receiving a hefty $60,000 fine just for his tanking shenanigans. Now that's enough to teach him a good lesson. Or maybe not, because his off-court attitude was even uglier. It started with getting slammed with a few traffic violations here and there. But you know what they say, little drops of water make an ocean. Like all of his other nasty habits, the Australian's traffic violation habits started to go wild. So much so that just after getting his hands on an orange BMW M3, Bernard somehow managed to rack up not one, not two, but 3 separate fines in a single day for violating traffic regulations. It was like he had a radar for finding trouble on the road. And just when you thought he had reached the peak of his traffic violation madness, he decided to take things up a notch. This time, he didn't just end up with a traffic violation code. The authorities stripped him of his driver's license after a speeding violation in his yellow Ferrari Spider. But it wasn't until 2015 that we actually realized how lost in fame the Australian had gone. After getting knocked out of the third round of the 2015 Miami Open, Tomic decided to treat himself to something really nice. And by treating himself, I mean throwing a knockout party at a luxury hotel that cost a jaw-dropping $10,000 per night. But little did Bernard know that his extravagant shindig would end up being more than he bargained for. Because that party ended up getting him locked up after attacking a local hotel security guard after several noise complaints were made. At this point, it was clear that the 8-year-old kid that swore he loved tennis from the earth to the sky had drowned in more fame than he could ever handle. It's like fame had wrapped him up, but instead of handling it like a seasoned pro, he stumbled and fell flat on his face. So there you have it, folks. Even though the Australian came to his senses in 2022 to ask the tennis world for forgiveness after letting them down, Bernard's story is proof that fame can be destructive when it gets in the wrong hands. Will Bernard ever get back on his feet? Maybe, or maybe not. The good thing is, at least he's learned his lesson. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to learn more interesting things about your favorite tennis players.